An enormously warm welcome on behalf of the APGRD. I'm Dr. Helen Eastman, and it's my absolute pleasure today to be chatting to Clare Pollard, poet, playwright and translator. Clare's originally from Bolton and currently lives in South London. She's a Doctor of Letters, having received an honorary doctorate for her services to literature from Bolton University. Her first collection of poetry, The Heavy Petting Zoo, came out in 1998 and was written while she was still at school and received an Eric Gregory Award. It was followed by Bedtime in 2002, Look Clare Look in 2005, which became a set text on the A-level syllabus. Her fourth collection, Changeling, came out in 2011 and was a Poetry Book Society recommendation. And her fifth collection, Incarnation, came out from Blood Axe in 2017. Her pamphlet, The Lives of Female Poets, is published by Bad Betty Press and came out in 2019. In 2022, her poem Pollen was shortlisted for the Ford Prize for Best Individual Poem. Clare's also a playwright, and her first play, The Weather, premiered at the Royal Court Theatre and was published by Faber. In 2012, she co-wrote the radio play Surface to Air with W.N. Herbert for Radio 4. She's toured widely with the British Council, including a residency in Beijing, and been involved in numerous translation projects, including co-translating The Sea Migrations by Ashalul Mohammed Yusuf for Blood Axe in 2017, which received a Penn Translates Award and was chosen as the Sunday Times Poetry Book of the Year. Clare also translated Ovid's Heroines, and I hope we're going to have time to chat about that today, which was published by Blood Axe in 2013. She also toured it as a one-woman show with J. Bird Live Literature. Early in 2011, Clare participated in the Visegrad Poets Project, bringing together female poets from across Europe to create new versions of each other's poems. And her translation of Agnieszka Wolny-Hamkalo's FM biography from the Polish was a runner-up in Modern Poetry and Translations competition. Clare's also translated many poems from Hungarian, particularly the work of Anna Szabo and Tamás Jonas. Her translations have appeared in Hungarian Quarterly, Poetry London, the Frogmore Papers, and the ARC anthology, New Order, Hungarian Poets of the Post-1989 Generation. Clare has worked as an editor, journalist, and teacher. She was editor of Modern Poetry and Translation, co-founded by Ted Hughes for 5 years, and poetry editor for The Idler. Clare has also co-edited an anthology for Blood Axe with James Byrne entitled Voice Recognition, 21 Poets for the 21st Century, edited 2 issues of Magma Poetry, and co-edited an issue of The Butcher's Dog. She's been a judge for the PBS Next Generation list, the Popesca European Poetry Translation Prize, the Manchester International Poetry Prize, the Northern Writers Awards, the T.S. Eliot Prize, and the Foyle Young Poets of the Year Award. Her articles and reviews have been published in The Guardian, The Independent, The TES, Critical Quarterly, Poetry London, Poetry Review, London Magazine, Lit Hub, and The Dark Horse, as well as appearances on The Verb, Woman's Hour, Poetry Please, and Newsnight Review. She's written and presented 2 documentaries for television and 1 for radio, My Male Muse, which was a Radio 4 Pick of the Year. We're here today to chat about Clare's prose debut, her first novel, which is absolutely stunning. This brilliant and beautiful book, Delphi. It's been published by Fig Tree in the UK and Avid Reader in the US, and is forthcoming in German, Dutch, and Spanish. And I can't wait to chat to Clare about it. Thank you so much for being here today to chat about this absolute brilliant novel, which I have been reading, carrying around, foisting copies onto people. I absolutely love it. And I didn't think I was ready for a lockdown novel, but it turns out I absolutely was. And I think it's the first novel I've read set in that particular period, and it captures that moment in such an extraordinary way. Can I ask you, were you actually writing it during lockdown as it was happening?
Sort of. What I was working on was a book about sort of oracles, prophecies, prediction, tarot, and so on, which is always something that's interesting me. My dad used to say he was psychic when I was a kid, and quite often made prophecies that came true. And I kind of believed him and didn't at the same time. And I think I've always had that in me. I used to read tarot cards and so on. So I was researching it, and I wasn't quite sure. I just knew it was an area I still wanted to dig into a bit more, but I wasn't sure if it would be a non-fiction book, because my last book was non-fiction, or maybe it was an idea for another poetry book. So I was doing that sort of research. And then when lockdown happened, I got to do very little research. I got to do very little writing. I was homeschooling my 2 kids. I almost didn't write anything for about 8 months. But I started seeing all the parallels with the pandemic, I think, and all the oracles and prophecies. Because what was Chris Whitty doing if he wasn't, giving us our weekly fix of prophecies every week with the with the charts. And I started seeing, you know, we were so pushed on screens, and I think a lot of contemporary sort of surveillance capitalism is all about prophecy. Google is in the prophecy business. That's how they make their money, by predicting how people are going to behave. And you saw sort of people's grades were starting to be done on algorithms, which basically prophesized how they might have messed up the exam if they'd had an exam, and so on and so forth. So I just started seeing these prophecies everywhere. And of course I wanted to write about the pandemic. When I say that now, people, it sounds crazy, because everyone goes, oh, I don't want to read about the pandemic. Oh, the last thing I want to read about is the pandemic. But for me, that's how I sort of process things. So there's no way I was going to live through a major event and not write about it. So the prophecy stuff and the lockdown stuff started to sort of come together in my mind. But it wasn't really till my children went back to school that I could write the novel properly. And I wrote it very, very fast, in a sort of fever, in about a month or so. And in fact, I was writing the last chapter as it's happening in the book, so that the ending, Boris Johnson says it's a year anniversary since the pandemic started, and he said, if only I just wish I'd known then what I know now. And that actually did happen, sort of live. I was live writing that as I was finishing up the manuscript.
That's extraordinary, and it does take you right back into that moment. And there was so much that I'd sort of almost forgotten about the pandemic as you lived it, that I then sort of, the novel took me straight back into. And actually it was incredible for sort of processing that, and also celebrating some of the glorious moments, but also remembering the intensity of being in a house homeschooling with your family. I at the end of this, you on the acknowledgements, you say, I think I've wanted to be a novelist for a very long time, and there's a sort of some meta moments in the novel where the speaker says, if I was capable of writing novels, I'd write a novel. There's a sort of acknowledgement of that process. And so I'm really interested in how this ended up in prose, because I'm so used, I'm a massive fan of your poetry and plays, but actually it almost shocked me, because I went, surely this isn't Clare's first novel. And then I thought, oh it is.
Yeah. I've always written in every single genre. I just like writing, and in fact I like the challenge of taking on a new genre and going down to the nuts and bolts of how it works. You know, I really enjoy that. Like once it never got made, but I got commissioned to write the script for a romantic comedy movie, and I'm never happier than when I've got like 20 books on how screenplays work, and I can sort of burrow down into that. I love the mechanics of writing. And I've always written across lots of genres. You know, I've written plays, I've written short stories. I have children's novels in the drawer that I've never published. You know, I wrote my first novels when I was about 4, so I've always been having a go. But I think poetry, I suppose I've had most success in poetry, and I think that it comes very natural to me because I work very well at the level of the line. You know, no one. I think I can write a line as good as anyone alive, basically, not to show off. But I think I'm really good at the level of the line. Whereas things like character and plotting and stuff, I think have taken me a lot more work and experience and attempts to sort of get there.
Yeah, I mean the at the level of the line, the prose I found absolutely extraordinary in this, and a total joy. But actually, I also loved the way it's structured, which I think is one of the joys of the book. Is the I don't want to give too much away to anyone who hasn't read it yet, but each chapter is structured through a different type of prophecy, and those linguistically, I loved all of those extraordinary titles of all these different types of prophecy. May I ask what is potentially a daft question? How many of those are real, and how many did you make up?
Well, I didn't make any of them up. I don't know. They are basically, I found a list on Wikipedia.
Wow. Okay.
Which is not what you're supposed to say, isn't it? You know, don't reference any of these in your academic articles, anyone. But I just found this amazing list on Wikipedia of types of divination, and there was just hundreds of these names, and it was like a found poem. I just thought it was such an extraordinary list. And first of all, I was just going to have it as a chapter in the book, like a found poem almost. And then when I had this idea though of using those as chapter titles, that's when I think the novel started to find its form and come together.
Yeah.
So I'm happy with that.
It's such a beautiful way of structuring, because it not only gives an incredible sort of structure to the narrative journey, but it's just such a celebration of all these different forms of divination, and the words themselves, just looking urticariamancy, phrenology, calcimancy, zoomancy, chiromancy, and those feel like they have a kind of a Greek color to them as well, because of the way they all derive from ancient Greek terms. So it feels like it's plugging into this really sort of deep tradition of divination. And you open with the quote from Anne Carson, Cassandra's inarticulable which is but tell me a bit about Cassandra in this novel, because Cassandra at the moment is becoming an icon for all kinds of things said and unbelieved. There have been quite a few recent texts that have linked Cassandra to the climate crisis, something that everybody is telling us but lots of people are ignoring, but she sort of bubbles away through this book from that initial quote, and I just wondered how you'd enjoyed delving into that story, I suppose, of the woman who tries to speak the future and isn't believed.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated by Cassandra. She's I wrote a poem about her in my book Changeling, it's about 12 years ago or so, where I really like the idea in the poem. I really like the idea that Cassandra can see the future. It means she can really see the future, so she can see all the way to like the end of the world by climate crisis, and what it would actually mean to see that much future. And nobody would believe you. They would think you're absolutely mad if you started gibbering about remote controls and things like she does in my poem. So I've always been fascinated by her. She's a sort of presiding spirit of the book. It's not there's not loads about her in the book, but I think it's just a sort of presence hangs there. There is something. We're all in a Cassandra moment, aren't we, where we sort of both are and aren't Cassandra. We can see these terrible things that are coming, but we don't want to believe ourselves, I think.
Yeah, that sense of like self-doubt feels quite strong in the book. The idea that the central character doesn't want to believe quite a lot of what they're processing or what they're being told as they go through, and that felt very true to that moment.
Yeah, she doesn't. On one hand, she's really genuinely lying awake worrying about climate change and stuff, and on the other, she's buying things with palm oil in them and things in plastic bags, and she says she just sort of clears her mind. It's kind of like her Zen meditation when she's in the supermarket, because you can't think about. Supermarkets is when I always feel it the most, because it's just literally everything you put in your basket, you're doing some kind of evil in the world. But you're an ordinary mum in a hurry. You've got to be able to buy some food in the supermarket and not torture yourself in a way. That's when you realise society needs to be fixed, because it can't be on individual choices.
Absolutely. And supermarkets took on these strange quality in lockdown, because for a while they were the only place you could go, so they were the only adventure you could have.
They were. The big shop was like the highlight of the week. I had some rows with my husband over that when he snuck on his bicycle off the Asda, and I was like, I was looking forward to that. That was like it's been keeping me going.
That was the kind of the connection with the outside world for quite a long time. There's a real yearning sense of place in the book of this trip to Delphi that hasn't happened yet, or that is being postponed, and I was sort of intrigued. So Delphi takes on this sort of iconic idea as a place, not just as the sort of seat of prophecy, but also as this place you can't go to because we're all locked down, or that we can't be taken to. And have you been to Delphi? Is that based on or do you yearn to go to Delphi?
I did actually get some money to go from the Society of Authors when I started this Oracle book, and I still haven't been. And I did try to go at one point, and it got cancelled.
So that's brilliantly
it's like that Cavafy poem, isn't it, about Ithaca, where is Homer's Odyssey, and it's this idea that when you get there, it's not going to make you rich or happy, but the thing is the journey. It's about the journey. And for me, Delphi's become my sort of Ithaca now. I feel like it's almost bound to be a letdown when I finally get there now, but it's given me this amazing journey. But yeah, genuinely, my holiday to Delphi also got deferred. I'd love to go there.
It's interesting, isn't it, about what that becomes as a symbol of the act of pilgrimage of that. Is that about sort of taking the time and the space to to stop and think about and it's like almost the furthest you can get away conceptually or culturally from life on a screen in lockdown. Imagine yourself at this extraordinary ancient site where place has meaning and the act of travel has meaning, the act towards something. There's a very strong sense of, because the novel is essentially trapped in a house or trapped in a suburban atmosphere, that the sense of place is unbelievably strong in it, and this very, very strong central relationship. Is it deliberate that the husband's called Jason? I was half wondering whether the novel was going towards a Medea moment.
Yeah, it is deliberate. But no, yeah, and I suppose I wanted to get people wondering a little bit. But I like the idea of them. I think he was someone who was very sort of golden boy when he was younger. You know, he was very handsome and athletic and knew where all the parties were. And it's this sort of, you should imagine this sort of Greek hero sort of young man who, you know, I've got a lot of friends like that, middle-aged men perhaps, who partied very hard when they're younger. And there is that idea of what do you do with that energy in middle age, or that sense of yourself when you have to be middle-aged. And, you know, Jason and the speaker's marriage is souring a little, not quite on a Medea level, but I quite like the sort of ironies that brought in.
It kept me on tennis. It's a very touching portrait of that, of where all that sort of energy goes when you are, I mean, and obviously the lockdown setting sort of intensifies that, but what you do with all that energy when you're constrained by the practicalities of parenting. And as such, I probably identified far too much with particularly the idea of how much of what's going on in your head feels like it has on the outside. Well, they're all quite lonely. I think the three central characters, although they're all together in this house, they're actually all very lonely. They don't really talk to each other that much. So they're stuck not just in the house, but in their own heads. I think the speaker's very stuck in her own head. Yeah, I mean, she's this formidably intelligent woman who talks about how the person she lives with sort of has no idea how much is going on in her head in the course of any day, and it's an extraordinary portrait, I think, of I found it almost sort of Ibsen-esque, I suppose, in terms of that idea of the completely the enormous intellectual and imaginative and creative capacity in a woman trapped in a domestic house. I was thinking back to, you know, Doll's House or Hedda Gabler, or those plays, in terms of what that portrait is of the sort of middle class trapping of female brilliance.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was hoping for that.
And in terms of her sort of journey through it, and this idea of trying to prophesy and see the future, you've obviously created a novel which is all about looking forward, but is done through the prism of looking back and sort of harnessing this classical sort of prototypes, I suppose. And I'm always interested in the answer to this question of why we go back to those sort of classical archetypes to talk about the present all the time, and why it is that we keep going back to sort of ancient stories to talk about the now. And I just wondered if you'd give us your insight on that question, which is the question, I suppose, in some ways, for classical reception.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer, but I do. I mean, it's not just classics for me, it's sort of any folklore and fairy tale and myth and legend, but I that's definitely a pattern over the whole of my 25-year career, that I keep going back to those stories. I think they have just, what I love is all those stories have they have a depth to them. There's something about, the tales of, you know, Orpheus or Demeter or whatever, that every generation seems to be able to find new depths in it, or something different to bring out of it emotionally. Or I mean, what is it that makes a... I was reading yesterday about Hans Christian Andersen, who I think is one of the last sort of people of the modern world, like named people, who actually wrote these stories that had that resonance that people can, like the Snow Queen and stuff, people can keep going back to. I'd love to be able to write them myself, but I can't, so I just sort of steal them off the Greeks.
It's not stealing. It's just using it as the slant, as the slant to your own truth, I suppose. That's a misquote of Emily Dickinson, isn't it? But they give you...
It's that sort of deep ambiguity, which a great poem would have, a sort of deep ambiguity. You know, you don't read it and think there's one meaning. When you read The Wasteland or something, it keeps giving. It's
yeah. The end of the novel, I don't want to give anything away for anyone who hasn't read it yet, so I'm going to be really careful about spoilers, but is very moving, and for me was one of the first creative pieces that I've read that tries to look at the impact on young people of the pandemic, or the impact on mental health of young people, and to face that honestly, and to be honest about what that whole experience might have done, and the intergenerational questions there, where in order to protect a lot of people in our society, children and young people went through a sort of fairly extraordinary experience in terms of removing all their social structures and their contact with the outside world, and it feels very sort of brave in that sense, and I wonder if it'll be the first of things that have to examine that question about what the sort of...
I don't think we're dealing with it at all at the moment, or talking about it, or
and it sort of starts that conversation. But do you think that is something that we're going to have to address over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Yeah, I think at the moment we're in a stage where we almost want to protect... We've normalized very quickly and are sort of all acting like it didn't happen a little bit, and that's why I wanted to sort of catch it while it was really fresh, because I mean, at the moment everyone's like, oh, I don't want to read about the pandemic, I don't want to talk about the pandemic, but also just as a society we're almost not mentioning it, and it was huge. It was like, I just want people to read my book and remember how absolutely insane it was. You know, it was, if you weren't in a household with someone, in a relationship, it was illegal to have sex. It was illegal to see your own mother. It was absolutely crazy. You know, it was absolutely crazy. And there were 4-year-olds who didn't play with another child for, 6 months or something. It was absolutely mad. I think it must have done so much damage to so many lives. But at the moment, there doesn't seem any will in the media or anything to even... There's supposed to be all this catch-up stuff in schools, but I haven't seen a drop of anything like that,
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how quickly that sort of conversation has moved on, and how much people are sort of scared of coming back. And in some ways that comes back to this question of prophecy, or seeing the future. It's almost like there's a complete denial that there will be any future impact of that incident, like that we've switched off the idea of and all the sort of characters and figures from it, whether it was Chris Whitty giving this sort of have sort of disappeared from public. So these people who were our prophets, I suppose, for a brief period of time are now gone, like they never had a role. And I wonder what it's like, I mean, in that world, I suppose, where presumably the impact is, I mean, we hear a lot about the financial impact of it, but very little about the social impact of what actually happened. And one of the things that I think you said it was important to write about it. What your book does is it tells the real story of something that in other cultures we've sort of mythologized. So when we read, I suppose, about a plague in history or in the Bible or something, it's a really abstract concept, but it's very hard to actually engage with the reality of that people lived through that, or that there was a reality to that. And I'm really interested in a book that essentially writes about a period of plague, or a period, that is real rather than just a sort of rhetorical construct in a historical setting. And actually the central character's desperate attempt to sort of perceive the future and how they're going to sort of come out of that places it on this really long timeline. I think I'm not sure if I'm doing justice in my description, but because the novel manages to incorporate so many points in sort of history and mythology with its although it's locked in a moment, it looks so far forward and so far back in its sort of frames of reference that actually it feels like it could tap into being about any point in human history where people have sort of bunkered down in a crisis, and that we don't necessarily have those voices because we don't have access to them, from the ordinary person living through a historical plague, or the ordinary person living through a historical crisis is not necessarily very well documented. And it feels like this novel is going to do something really important for that documentation of that period. Are you still going to write the non-fiction book about prophecy?
No.
Is it all in the novel now?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm going to give the Greeks a little rest for a bit.
No, that's not what we want to hear at all.
Well, the thing is, I can't always write tragedies. That's the problem. That's something we've not spoken about the book, but like I think because I also wrote a play which was a tragedy, and I think as soon as I write stories, I'm very drawn to that tragic plot arc, which is partly why I love the Greeks. I mean, what really got me into the Greeks was I was at Cambridge doing English literature, but it was doing the tragedy paper. And that really was my entry point. And so I'm very drawn to that tragic arc. Not, I think, because I like lots of dead bodies at the end. And in fact, that's not quite how either of my play or my novel end. But there's something about that moment of recognition, I think.
Yeah.
And I think as a society, we're in a sort of tragic moment in a way where we've had this, did you say hubris? I can never remember.
Hubris, yeah.
This sort of overreaching as humanity. And now we're in the moment where we're going to have to face the consequences. And we've got that moment of realizing what we've done, I think, so I'm very interested in that tragic arc.
That's very brilliantly put, isn't it? That somehow at the moment the whole human race is having its moment of realizing that it's overreached itself in terms of its relationship with the planet, and now is in a sort of tipping point spiral downwards. The tragic arc would tell us that now we're past that tipping point. There's nothing we can do, and I guess the job now is to work out whether we can change our genre and turn that story.
Yeah. So my next,
can we find a happy ending? I have an
inkling of an idea for another novel, but I'm hoping it's not going to be a tragedy this time.
What's
might be more of a fairy tale.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the novel as tragedy, what you've done very brilliantly is given us three protagonists in a sort of fixed space.
Yeah, unity of place, I was thinking.
Yeah, which is really and then all the other voices around it sort of become choral, I suppose, or whether they're coming in through radio or television, or this constant sense of the presence of the the iPad or Zoom or whatever it is. But it's quite rare actually to be able to construct something with that sort of the way the Greeks would have done it with three central characters. That's the resource that you've got. But obviously the pandemic sort of gives you that. It gives you the ability to trap three characters in a world and watch how that plays out and what that tragic sort of story is going to be. And the first person narrative gives us so much opportunity to see the sort of central characters' journey through that and the choices that they're making and what revolves around that. So yes, so I think it is. I like the idea that maybe the next piece can't be in that genre for the sake of the planet. Although I suspect maybe it will have to be. You said darkly. I don't know. I'm not sure whether the human race is ready yet to have its, an agnoresis moment and realize what it's done. But maybe we're there. I wanted to take the opportunity, if it's all right, to ask you about another of your forays into classics, and that's your extraordinary version of Ovid's Heroines, which is a book that I've carried around in my bag while traveling on many occasions, because it's definitely a book to carry. It's got, again, this really strong sense of place, and your introduction to it I've read a few times, and I love the way that you talk about you decided to start writing it while in a certain place, drinking champagne under the Mediterranean sun. But for anyone who hasn't encountered it, it's an extraordinary translation is probably the wrong word, but the translation / version of Ovid's Herodes, which is the his first person monologues for women in ancient literature, in which he imagines many of the women who of classical literature, and what they want to say to the men who've abandoned them. Is that a reductive way to describe that?
Well, that's about 50% of them, certainly. Yeah, that's more than not.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a bit about how you encountered that, and that act of, it's more than an act of translation. I think it's an act of finding those women and re-breathing life into them.
I just it's an extraordinary book, isn't it? An extraordinary text that had sort of fallen out of favour, I think, a little, because of course I'd read Metamorphoses and heard of Ovid and so on, but I'd never heard about this book. And someone recommended I take it on holiday with me when I went to Rome, and I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe I hadn't heard of this book. I was someone who came of age when Carol Ann Duffy's The World's Wife was like the biggest book it ever hit poetry, the sort of super hit. And she stole the whole idea of Ovid. Like, why no one why no one told me this, and I'm not a classicist, and I don't speak Latin, so I thought, well, I can't translate it, but it sort of kept sitting there and looking at me, and so I worked from very old sort of prose translation, the lower, to start with, and I got a Latin dictionary out of the library, and I just started picking through it, and I felt like I was blowing the dust off, and it just seemed to me so remarkable. I started with Medea. That was, I'm crazy about Medea, and it worked so well that then I thought I'm gonna try them all. But I think this book's had an extraordinary, well, not necessarily my translation, but Ovid's Herodes is having a moment in a way, and there are so many novels now in the voices of women from Greek and Roman myth. It's so absolutely absurd. But I certainly know, like, Natalie Haynes did an event with me when this came out. So she I always think she must have been a little bit inspired.
I think so. And you're right. There's a sort of real plethora at the moment of Natalie Haynes, Pat Barker, Madeline Miller, these novels that are taking a female perspective on. And actually, I've just been working on Lesia Ukrainka, the Ukrainian writer's version of Cassandra, where she did that just over 100 years ago, of retelling the end of the Trojan War.
Crystal Wolf's version is amazing.
Course, yeah. So literature's sort of littered with these female retellings, but obviously, of course, Ovid comes first, and I think your version is an amazing way in for anybody who wants to read, because it really captures I don't know, the voices, the energy of those characters coming through, and it's definitely a much better way in than reading the Lerb or a sort of technical. I
think I liked being the first woman to translate it to my knowledge, into English. Although, of course, it's a man, so you've got this interesting bit about being a woman, pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman. But I quite like that, and I think he plays with that because he has like Hercules cross-dressing at one point. And, you know, I think he totally knows it's a sort of quite subversive thing that he's done. This whole book in women's voices.
Yeah, I think it opens up really interesting questions about voices and what voices we adopt. And I mean, that is always a debate, isn't it, about how what we do and don't ventriloquize but the voices sort of shine through that text. And one of the things before I'd read your version of it, I always found it quite hard to identify with that, but because it felt like so many of the women were in a state of sort of stasis, so many of them have no agency and they are sort of waiting, but somehow they feel like they've got they feel more empowered in your version, and maybe that might just be like the linguistic vibrancy of it, that they feel they've got an energy to them. But I think it's interesting to think about how we as readers now engage with a text which is almost all of the women have no agency there, and how we enjoy that rather than find it a sort of negative text, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is probably women didn't have much agency then, but I think it's an incredible act of sympathy, of empathy with them by Ovid, because they're definitely women who should have agency. You know, I think they're really, one thing he got criticised for, or people have said, is, oh, they all just sound like Ovid, you know, they're too clever, they're too, but you know, he doesn't dumb them down or anything. Well, except for one or two, but mainly, you know, they're these incredibly formidable, intelligent women, and they read a bit like sort of Shakespearean soliloquies, actually. So there is a little bit of agency because it's sort of thought in action. They're like that. You can see them making these big decisions, like Medea. It's very empathic, but a lot of empathy for her, because it's like the moment before you going, oh no, don't do it, but you can see how she ends up backed into making that decision because it's the only agency she can have in a way. But they're incredibly intelligent women, I think.
Yeah, and that idea that somehow the rhetoric or the writing is about understanding choices, I think really shines through, and the idea that actually taking a figure from the past or a figure from a story and trying to understand how the choices that they make could have been made, or to unpick is an act of empathy, and the language empowers us in sort of following that through. And
it's not just they're evil, you can see these really human decisions being made and how you could get yourself into that corner, you know.
Yeah, and it feels you know, there's obviously a lot of periods of literature where female characters are not given that level of sort of interrogation, I suppose, or that lack of cognizance in their writing, and I felt like there was a sort of parallel between that and Delphi in terms of a really strong female voice at the center of it, and taking us through a whole set of choices massively limited by society. You know, people who've got a very limited set of choices, and therefore watching how they play out becomes fascinating. I know that you did a live tour with J-Bird where you performed what was it like to actually embody all these women?
Absolutely loved it. It was probably the highlight of my whole writing career. Being Medea was like, you don't get many shots at that role. I used to love acting at high school, so I'm a bit of a frustrated actress anyway, which I think is why I like poetry too, because it's much more performative than novel writing or whatever. So it was enormous fun. We toured it twice, and the second time we toured it, I was quite heavily pregnant, so doing Medea with the baby bump felt quite subversive. There was a bit though that I fell to my knees and I had to get up again, and it was every night I could see all the production were like, is she gonna be able to get up? But I did.
Other than Medea, which were your favourites to perform?
But I'm a tragedy nut, so it was great to be Phaedra as well, and I thought that was I like the more conventionally evil women, I suppose. You know, that rage and madness, that's what I like doing, working myself up.
Excellent. Given that experiment, I suppose, with the verse line, with performance, with those characters, can you see yourself? I mean, I'm angling here on behalf of classics, but can you see yourself writing a version of one of the tragedies?
Yeah, I would love to. That's definitely a bucket list thing that I haven't done. I think, yeah, that might be the one thing that would lure me back. Anyone who's listening, to yeah, I'd like to do it.
Yes, because I think it'd be great if somebody who is listening could make that happen, please, because I'd like to see that as well. And just to be really I suppose technical about it, the verse that you write in Ovid, do you think that's the verse of performance? Is that how I just wondered how you came to a decision about the actual texture of the verse in that. Were you thinking about performance? Were you as opposed to it being on the page?
Yeah, I was. And I felt like the main technical challenge is to not make the women all sound the same. Because that was the criticism of most translations. And to be honest, most translations, even like the very good ones like Harold Isbell's, the women do sound a little bit samey. So for me, that was the main technical challenge, is how to make them sound different. And if they're all in the same sort of tum-ti-tum couplets or whatever, it's going to be much harder to get that difference between voices. Obviously, I like Hughes's free verse of it as well. So, but I just thought it would be much easier to get distinct, different music between the voices and stuff if I allowed myself to be in free verse. That was the decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And they feel very different, and they sort of leap off the page. I've got a real soft spot for Phaedra in your version. I can absolutely imagine her.
The other thing I just did was have that real that they also always say in a basic theatre course, like, what's your character's motivation? And I think thinking of each of them of actually having quite different motivations in their letters, that was the other thing that allowed me to give them a distinct voice. Thinking, well, this is trying to seduce someone, whereas this is a suicide note, whereas it, and then once you realise the motivations are quite different, that sort of changed the tone of them as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's sort of it's fascinating sort of literary construct, that, isn't it? The letter as performance text, because actually they're letters, but they're designed to be heard, and read aloud, and that allows you to use the sound of the verse to create the voice within them. But we're all sort of we're listening, but we're complicit in the idea that this is a letter that's designed to be said. And of course that letter as a format is it's interesting to think about the loss of that going forward. So many writers we know so much about from their letters, and actually the sort of the loss of letter writing as an art, I think, is a really interesting sort of future question about literature in
but think of all these archived Zoom talks we'll have.
The irony of us chatting today on Zoom post-pandemic has not escaped me, that actually this was a format that none of us had ever encountered before lockdown, and now it's become our absolute default format for discussing literature, from one person's office to another person's office, in terms of how we now have these conversations, and even it's funny that is extending beyond the pandemic, that is a sort of cultural and paradigm shift that's going to sustain. I'm not sure if Cassandra saw that one coming, but actually that we're all now going to conduct. Absolutely. Has she foretold a trip to you to Delphi, where you get to actually read the book on site? I like the idea of you reading from the book.
I've seen a couple of photos of my book on Instagram at Delphi, so the book's got there before me, but maybe
that's kind of wonderful, isn't it? And kind of the idea of people taking off, journeying out into the world with the book in the before we finish, I just wanted to ask, really, by sort of saying the book is out and it is absolutely extraordinary, and I'm going to keep telling everybody to get their copies and read it. And for anyone who thinks they're not ready for a lockdown novel, you absolutely are. The moment you start reading it, you realize that it's an incredible way of processing this strange thing that's happened to us in a much wider and beautiful context. And it's funny, and it's gripping, and it's playful, and it, you know, educates you about 1,000,001 ways of prophesying the future. So and is personal, and all the things that a novel should be. So going forward, and I suppose I'm asking you to Cassandra yourself, but will there be more prose novels coming?
Yeah, I hope so. I had so many novels turned down before this one. I don't want to get carried away. I'm very bad at building on successes. I seem to just flip from one thing to another. But I hope so. Yeah, I definitely hope so. And I'm writing some new poems at the moment as well. It's been a while since I wrote my own poems. So
that's really, really, really exciting to hear. And so I'm going to say a massive thank you for chatting to me today. And I know that for lots of people, I hope this will be a great gateway to them reading Delphi, which is completely brilliant, and also to going and exploring the Ovid's Heroines, which is a great text. Carry it around in your bag while traveling. It's is the best way to experience it, I think. So thank you very much, and I hope we get to have another one of these chats when you are translating a tragedy, have more poems on your thing, or have the next installment of Cassandra's future predictions. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Helen.